It's hard to know where to start when talking about Vietnam. The memories come at me in flashes, like the bursts of light from the artillery rounds that used to light up the jungle at night. But there's one day, or rather one chain of days, that stands out in my mind. I arrived in Vietnam in early 1968, a fresh recruit in the Marine Corps, nervous but eager to prove myself. My platoon was stationed near Quang Tri, close to the DMZ. I quickly learned the rhythm of life in the jungle. Intense patrols, moments of quiet punctuated by chaos, and the ever-present weight of the unknown. The air was always thick with the smell of wet earth, sweat, and something metallic, a constant reminder that we were in a place where life and fate were tied together in ways I couldn't yet understand. My first few weeks felt like training wheels for the real thing. We patrolled, set up ambushes, and got used to the terrain. But nothing could prepare us for the reality of combat. The first time we were ambushed, everything happened so fast. 1 second, the jungle was alive with the chirps of birds and the rustle of leaves. The next, it was full of gunfire, screams, and the deafening roar of M60s. That first fight left me shaken. I saw a man, one of ours, hit by a burst of rounds. I remember the way he just dropped, like a marionette with its strings cut. His name was Ramirez. He had shown me how to properly lace my boots the week before. I'll never forget how his body looked crumpled in the grass, the jungle swallowing him up as we moved forward. There wasn't time to grieve then. There never was. That ambush taught me lessons that no amount of training could. You learn quickly in war, or you don't learn at all. One of the hardest lessons came during a patrol just 2 weeks later. We were sent to check out reports of an enemy supply cache. It sounded simple enough. Reconnaissance, report back, maybe destroy some supplies if we found anything. It turned into something else entirely. We set out at dawn, our boots sinking into the wet ground with each step. The squad was quiet. We'd all been out enough times to know that the jungle had a way of lulling you into a false sense of security before everything unraveled. The thick canopy overhead kept the sunlight from fully breaking through, leaving us in a dim, green world where shadows moved and sounds played tricks on your mind. I was on point that day, the tip of the spear. It was a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride because it meant the squad trusted you enough to put you out front, and dread because if something went wrong, you'd likely be the first to know and the first to fall. The path we followed was more of a game trail than anything else, narrow and winding through dense underbrush. Every few minutes, I'd signal the squad to stop and crouch, listening for anything that felt out of place. The jungle was full of noise, birds, insects, the occasional rustle of a monkey. But you learned to separate the natural sounds from the ones that spelled danger. That morning, it was quiet. Too quiet. About 3 clicks in, we came across the first sign of trouble. A claymore mine, set at knee height, hidden in the roots of a tree. The tripwire was faint but there, glinting like a spider web in the filtered light. I crouched low and signaled the squad to halt. Our engineer, a wiry kid named Simmons, moved up to disarm it. I watched him work, his hands steady but quick. He disabled the mine, gave me a thumbs up, and we moved on. It wasn't long before we found more traps. Punji pits camouflaged with leaves, another tripwire rigged to a grenade, even a few primitive but deadly spike boards propped to swing down at chest height. These weren't just random traps. They were signs that we were entering contested ground. The tension was thick enough to choke on. By midday, we found what we were looking for, an enemy cache hidden in a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a few crates of ammunition and medical supplies, but it was enough to warrant calling in support. While we waited for the engineers to move up and destroy it, we set up a perimeter. That's when the first shots came. The crack of an AK-47 split the air, followed by the unmistakable zing of a round hitting the metal edge of a crate. "Contact!" someone shouted, and the clearing erupted into chaos. I dove for cover behind a tree, my heart hammering in my chest. The enemy was dug in on the far side of the clearing, using the dense brush for cover. I couldn't see them, but their bullets found their mark, forcing us to hunker down. Simmons was next to me, his face pale but determined as he returned fire with his M16. "Flank left," our squad leader bellowed over the din. I nodded and signaled to the two guys nearest me. Crawling on our stomachs, we moved through the underbrush, trying to circle around to the enemy's weak side. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the earthy scent of the jungle, a combination that still haunts me to this day. We reached a position where we could see their line, a shallow trench hastily dug but effective. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, their faces grim and focused. My hands trembled as I adjusted my grip on the rifle, steadying myself for the fight. "On my mark," I whispered, counting to 3 in my head before opening fire. The sudden volley caught them off guard, and a few fell before they could react. The rest scattered, their return fire sporadic but still dangerous. In the chaos, I spotted one of them, a boy, really, crawling through the brush with a grenade in hand. His eyes met mine for a split second, wide with fear and something else I couldn't name. I fired before I could think, the recoil jarring against my shoulder. He crumpled, the grenade rolling harmlessly to the side. It wasn't until the fight was over, until the jungle was silent again, that the weight of what I'd done hit me. It couldn't have been more than 16, maybe younger. I sat there, staring at his body, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. We secured the area and radioed for extraction. The engineers arrived and destroyed the cache, the explosion sending a plume of smoke and debris into the air. We found a few more bodies in the aftermath, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. The ride back to base was quiet. No one spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept seeing the boy's face, replaying that moment over and over in my head. There was no time to dwell on it, though. The war didn't allow for reflection. We cleaned our rifles, ate our rations, and got ready to do it all over again the next day. But that boy stayed with me. He still does. Even now, decades later, I can see his face when I close my eyes. The days after that firefight were quieter, but not by much. There was always something pulling at the edge of your nerves, a strange noise in the jungle, the sight of an animal darting through the underbrush that made you think it was something more. My senses stayed on high alert, even when there was nothing but the hum of insects to accompany us. The next operation came sooner than I wanted. They always did. We were tasked with securing a small hamlet that intelligence suggested was being used as a staging area for enemy forces. I remember thinking it was another routine patrol, another chance to walk into the unknown and come out the other side intact. We approached the hamlet just before dawn, using the dim light and the mist rising from the jungle to our advantage. The village was quiet when we got there. Too quiet, as they say. It looked abandoned, the kind of eerie silence that makes your skin crawl. The squad moved in cautiously, spreading out to check the huts and surrounding fields. I was assigned to sweep the far side of the hamlet with Simmons and a few others. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that made your clothes stick to your skin and every movement feel like a chore. As we rounded the corner of one of the larger huts, we found a shallow pit partially concealed by a tarp. Inside were caches of rice, weapons, and ammunition. It was clear the hamlet wasn't as innocent as it seemed. We radioed the squad leader to let him know what we'd found. That's when it all went to hell. The first mortar round hit about 50 yards from us, shaking the ground and sending a plume of dirt and debris into the air. The blast knocked me off my feet, my ears ringing as I scrambled for cover. Another round hit closer, and then the small arms fire began. They'd been waiting for us, dug in along the tree line and hidden in the brush. It was an ambush, the kind you don't walk away from unless you're very lucky or very smart. The squad rallied quickly, finding cover where we could and returning fire. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid tang of burning wood as some of the huts caught fire. I found myself behind a fallen tree, my rifle pressed tight against my shoulder as I scanned for targets. To my right, Simmons was hunkered down behind a low wall, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked over at me and gave a quick nod, the kind of silent communication that said, "I've got your back." We held our position for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The enemy fire was relentless, forcing us to stay pinned down. Every now and then, one of us would pop up to return fire, but it felt like trying to hold back the tide with a bucket. Then came the sound we were waiting for, the whoosh of incoming air support. 2 F-4 Phantoms roared overhead, their engines deafening as they lined up for a strike. I pressed myself against the ground as the first bomb hit, the explosion sending shockwaves through the earth. The Phantoms made 2 passes, each one leaving a trail of fire and destruction in its wake. When it was over, the jungle was eerily quiet again, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the distant cries of the wounded. We regrouped and swept the area, finding what was left of the enemy forces. Most of them had been caught in the airstrikes, their positions obliterated by the precision bombing. I tried not to look too closely at the bodies, focusing instead on clearing the area and making sure it was safe. It was only later, back at the base, that I had time to process what had happened. We'd won that fight, but it didn't feel like a victory. I kept thinking about the villagers, where they'd gone, if they were complicit, or if they'd been caught in the crossfire. War had a way of blurring the lines between right and wrong, leaving you to navigate a world of gray where nothing was certain. I thought back to the boy from the last mission, his face still fresh in my mind. I wondered if any of the enemy we fought that day had been like him, young, scared, just doing what they thought was right. The weight of those thoughts settled heavily on me, but there was no time to dwell. The next day, we were back in the jungle, moving toward another objective. The jungle had a way of swallowing you whole. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, until you couldn't remember the last time you'd slept through the night or eaten something that didn't taste like metal and ash. I was starting to feel like a ghost of myself, just moving from one mission to the next, doing what I had to do to keep going. One of the toughest missions we faced came a few weeks after the ambush at the hamlet. Intelligence reported a concentration of enemy forces in a region known as the Iron Triangle, a dense, hostile area where the Viet Cong had dug an extensive network of tunnels. It was a place that had swallowed entire platoons before, and now it was our turn to test our luck. The operation started with a helicopter insertion. The ride-in was tense, the drone of the Huey's rotors vibrating through the air as we sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping our rifles like lifelines. I remember looking out the open side of the chopper, watching the jungle rush up to meet us. The LZ was hot, and the second the skids touched the ground, we were running, fanning out into defensive positions. The enemy didn't wait long to make their presence known. Sniper fire from the tree line forced us to keep our heads down as we secured the perimeter. We pushed forward cautiously, clearing one section of the jungle at a time, always aware that we could stumble onto a trap, or worse, an ambush at any moment. By midday, we found the first tunnel entrance. It was hidden beneath a thick tangle of brush, the kind of thing you'd walk right past if you weren't looking for it. The tunnel was small, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and it smelled of damp earth and something else, something sharp and metallic. We called in a specialist team to deal with it, men trained to navigate those claustrophobic spaces and flush out the enemy. Watching them disappear into the darkness was like watching someone walk into their own grave. I couldn't imagine the courage it took to go down there, knowing full well what might be waiting on the other side. While the specialists worked, we held our position outside the entrance, scanning the jungle for movement. The tension was suffocating, each minute dragging by like an eternity. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us erupted. An explosion tore through the clearing, throwing me backward into the dirt. My ears rang as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Booby traps, rigged to catch anyone who found the tunnels. Simmons was nearby, clutching his arm, blood streaming through his fingers. I crawled over to him, my hands shaking as I fumbled for his first aid kit. The blast had taken a chunk out of his forearm, but he was conscious, gritting his teeth through the pain. "You're going to be okay," I told him, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We radioed for medevac, but the jungle canopy made extraction nearly impossible. We had to carry Simmons back to a clearing, all the while under sporadic sniper fire. It was one of the longest, hardest marches of my life. Every step felt like it might be my last, every shadow a potential threat. When the chopper finally arrived, it felt like salvation. We loaded Simmons and the other wounded aboard, watching as the Huey lifted off and disappeared into the sky. Then it was back to the mission, back to the jungle that seemed determined to consume us all. That night, as we set up camp, I couldn't stop thinking about Simmons. He'd been with me from the start, one of the few constants in a world of chaos. I hoped he'd make it, that he'd get patched up and sent home. But deep down, I knew that even if he did, the war would never really leave him. It never left any of us. The next day, we continued the push into the Iron Triangle, finding more tunnels, more traps, and more evidence of the enemy's presence. Each discovery felt like a small victory, but it was hard to celebrate when you knew what it had cost to get there. The jungle didn't care about victories or losses. It just kept growing, swallowing up everything in its path, including us. The deeper we pushed into the Iron Triangle, the more the jungle seemed to close in around us. The air was heavy, thick with humidity and the faint smell of rot, and the undergrowth was so dense that even the sunlight struggled to make its way through. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. By the third day, we were all running on fumes. The nights offered little in the way of rest. We took turns standing watch, listening for the faintest sound of movement. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with restless dreams of traps and ambushes. It was on one of those nights that we were hit again. I was half asleep, my rifle resting across my lap, when the first shots rang out. I snapped awake, my heart pounding as I scrambled for cover. The jungle lit up with the flashes of muzzle fire, and the air filled with the sharp cracks of AK-47s and the heavier thud of our M60 machine guns. The attack was fast and brutal. They came at us from multiple directions, using the dense foliage to their advantage. It was chaos, men shouting, rounds zipping through the air, the ground shaking with the impact of mortar shells. I found myself pinned behind a fallen tree, firing blindly into the darkness. The adrenaline was pumping so hard that I barely registered the burn in my muscles or the sting of cuts from flying debris. All that mattered was staying alive. Somehow, we managed to hold them off. As quickly as the attack had started, it ended, the enemy melting back into the jungle. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the noise of battle. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath, before crawling out to assess the damage. We lost 2 men that night. I didn't know them well, but their absence was keenly felt. In a place like this, even a stranger's death felt personal. We buried them in shallow graves marked with makeshift crosses, a somber reminder of how quickly everything could change. The next day, we found what we'd been searching for, a major tunnel complex, its entrances hidden beneath layers of brush and debris. This one was bigger than anything we'd seen before, its dark openings yawning like the mouths of some ancient beast. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for a specialist team this time. The squad leader called for volunteers, and before I knew it, my hand was in the air. I don't know what compelled me, pride, duty, maybe just the numbness that had started to settle over me. Whatever it was, it landed me at the entrance of the tunnel, flashlight in one hand and pistol in the other. Crawling into that tunnel was like entering another world. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of earth and something else, something metallic like blood. The walls closed in around me, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. The first stretch of the tunnel was empty, just a long, narrow passage leading into the darkness. But as I moved deeper, I started to see signs of life. Discarded supplies, a broken sandal, the remnants of a fire. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Each step forward a test of my courage. Then I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from somewhere up ahead. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could make out the shape of a man crouched in the shadows. I raised my pistol, my finger hovering over the trigger, but before I could fire, he turned and bolted deeper into the tunnel. I gave chase, my boots scraping against the dirt floor, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. The chase ended in a small chamber, where a man joined 2 others. They turned to face me, their eyes wide with fear and desperation. For a moment, none of us moved, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Then one of them lunged, and the spell was broken. The fight was over in seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it was done, I stood there, breathing hard, my hands shaking as I looked at what I'd done. I didn't have time to process it. The squad leader's voice crackled over the radio, calling me back to the surface. I made my way out of the tunnel, blinking against the sudden brightness as I emerged into the sunlight. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We destroyed the tunnel complex, collapsing its entrances with explosives and marking the area on our maps. By the time we returned to base, we were too exhausted to do much more than eat and collapse into our cots. But that night, as I lay there staring up at the canvas roof of the tent, the memories of the tunnel crept back into my mind. The faces of the men I'd encountered down there haunted me, their fear mirrored in my own. War had a way of stripping everything down to its barest essentials: survival, fear, the instinct to fight or flee. But it also left scars, the kind you couldn't see but felt all the same. I didn't sleep much that night, and when the sun rose the next morning, I was already preparing myself for the next mission. The day we left the Iron Triangle felt like a small victory, but there was no sense of celebration. The jungle had taken its toll on all of us, and the weight of what we had seen and done lingered in the air like a heavy fog. We packed up our gear, trudged back to the extraction point, and waited for the helicopters that would take us away from that cursed place. The flight back was quiet. No one spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I looked out at the jungle passing beneath us, its green expanse seeming endless. From up there, it was easy to forget the horrors hidden beneath the canopy, the traps, the tunnels, the memories of faces I couldn't erase. When we landed back at base, the first thing I did was clean my rifle. It had become a ritual of sorts, a way to ground myself and feel like I had some measure of control in a world that constantly felt on the verge of unraveling. As I worked, I thought about Simmons, wondering if he'd made it to a proper hospital, if he was on his way home. I hoped he was, but the thing about Vietnam was that there was no time to dwell. The war kept moving, and so did we. Before long, we were back in the jungle, back to the patrols and the firefights and the constant gnawing fear that the next step you took might be your last. One mission in particular stands out as the beginning of the end for me. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, nothing we hadn't done 100 times before. The objective was to secure a stretch of road that had been used by the enemy to transport supplies. We set out before dawn, moving quickly but carefully, our eyes scanning the jungle for any signs of movement. We were about halfway to the objective when it happened. I was walking point again, my senses on high alert, when I felt something shift beneath my boot. It was subtle, just the faintest give of the earth, but it was enough. "Booby trap!" I shouted, diving to the side just as the explosion ripped through the air. The blast was deafening, a searing wave of heat and force that threw me into the underbrush. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was alive or dead. When I came to, I was on my back, staring up at the jungle canopy. My ears were ringing, and my body felt like it had been hit by a truck. I tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through my leg, and I realized I'd been hit. The medics were on me in seconds, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they assessed the damage. "You're lucky," one of them said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. "Could have been a lot worse." They patched me up as best they could and called for a medevac. As I lay there waiting, the rest of the squad secured the area, their faces grim. I hated leaving them behind, hated feeling like I was abandoning them, but there was no choice. The helicopter ride back to base was a blur. The pain in my leg was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the guilt gnawing at me. I replayed the moment of the explosion over and over in my head, wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have spared the squad the risk and danger of carrying me out. When we reached the field hospital, they stabilized me and prepped me for transport to a larger facility. The doctor told me I'd be heading to Japan for further treatment, and after that, it was likely I'd be sent stateside. "You're done," he said, his tone matter of fact. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me was relieved. I'd made it out alive, something not everyone could say. But another part of me felt hollow, like I was leaving something unfinished. The flight to Japan was long and quiet, giving me plenty of time to think. I thought about the men I'd served with, the ones I'd lost, and the ones I'd left behind. I thought about the boy in the jungle, the one I couldn't stop seeing in my dreams. I thought about Simmons, hoping he was safe, hoping he'd made it home. The hospital in Japan was a stark contrast to the jungle, a place of clean, white walls and soft-spoken nurses who moved with the kind of calm you don't see in a war zone. They treated my injuries, but the scars I carried weren't just on my body. I spent weeks there, healing, before I was finally sent home. The flight back to the States was surreal. I looked out the window at the clouds below, wondering how I'd fit back into a world that felt so far removed from the one I'd been living in. When I stepped off the plane, I was greeted by silence. There were no parades, no celebrations, just a quiet airport and the faces of strangers who didn't understand what I'd been through. I tried to go back to my old life, but nothing felt the same. The memories of Vietnam clung to me like a second skin, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake them. Even now, all these years later, they're still with me. The jungle, the faces, the sounds, they're etched into my mind, a part of me I'll carry forever. Some days, I wonder if I did enough, if I made the right choices. But then I remember Simmons and the boy in the jungle and the man I fought beside. And I realize that the only thing you can do in war is survive and hope that, in the end, it was enough.